what the aim is of the overall forum. I think it was mentioned a number of times to how we see the challenges and in fact to exchange the experience for the sake of adjusting the policies and measures for poverty reduction in Uzbekistan. We speak in a country that took the poverty reduction relatively recent in its priority development agenda. It was early 2020 and then the crisis of COVID came and the crisis keep coming. But the determination to put the poverty reduction at the center of the policy remains. And particularly important, I find this forum happening at the time when the next generation of reforms are to be introduced, the harder ones, as the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, that require even more that the poverty reduction effort is tailored and targeted very carefully, that it neutralizes in a way the harshness of the reforms. So this is the overall aim of the reform. This session is about looking in what has been done, assessing the effectiveness of the approach that was applied by the government of Uzbekistan so far, what were the successes or not so successes, what adjustments are needed, alternative strategies, and so on. And for that purpose, we have a very good panel, I think, the structured very well. We have, in fact, 5 panelists here present, and we have 2 online. We will aim to have 5 to a maximum 6 minutes, and I will be reminding the panelists for responding to the initial set of questions with the ambition to have some questions and answers after and discussion. So let me stop here. A great honor to be part of this forum and particularly of this session. I will start with inviting my colleague from UNDP, Mr. Balázs Horvat, who is online. He is a resident representative in Botswana. But he used to serve longer in the capacity of senior economist for Asia Pacific. So he has a lot of experience in terms of inequality, poverty, informality, and the empirical results of different policies that were made in such a context. So I invite Balázs for his short presentation. Balázs, do you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much, Matilda. Can we get the presentation up, or should I share?
I think the technical team is helping.
Okay, very good. So what I will be talking about is the broader context of poverty reduction. We all know market-driven growth can help reduce poverty, but it also generally increases inequality. So policies are often used to try to offset this through regulation and the tax benefit system. And unfortunately, these act mostly on the formal sector. And what we find is that the informality of employment causes problems. It creates a huge gap in social protection, leaving out many who need it most. And it generally is a bigger problem for countries with the lower per capita income. So we have a high welfare equilibrium with low informality, which raises tax revenues and then facilitates strong social protection. So we can have an easier path towards social stability, higher productivity, and real incomes. And a low welfare equilibrium, where high informality, low tax revenues, and weak social protection are the norm, and as a result, low productivity. Can we go to the next slide, please? What I will be talking about is some results from a forthcoming regional human development report for Asia Pacific that I had worked on with many colleagues. First, and these two are possibly relevant for poverty reduction in Uzbekistan. The first is that you can decompose the change in poverty into an impact that is driven by rising average income, and into a separate one driven by the reduction in inequality, or maybe an increase in inequality, in which case it's a negative impact. And very interestingly, the relative size of these two factors can be very different. And we see that when we compare Mongolia with Vietnam, or even within a single country, in China, urban versus rural. And this is very relevant information for policymakers. And another thing that we have done is we have calculated local inequality for segments of the income distribution. And when the picture comes up, I will explain it much better. And there is a remarkable consistency in the results, and that shows that local inequality is relatively low for the biggest part of the income distribution, but it shoots up when we talk about the poorest and the richest. And we don't particularly care about inequality among the rich, but we do care about the poor. So reaching the poor with social protection can have an outsized impact on reducing inequality, and therefore it can also help reduce poverty. Now, all you need to remember from this slide is that it is possible to do this decomposition. This is done on Mongolian data. It is anonymized VAT data, so it's about consumption. And what you see is that the impact is about twice as big from redistribution as from the growth in general average income. And that is a remarkable result, and it is very useful for policymakers. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next slide is about local inequality. And what I mean by that, and now you can see why we call these results smiley faces. What I mean is these are percentiles in the income distribution. And if you calculate Gini's locally for the 0 to 10 percentile, and then the second to the 11th, and then the third to the 12th, and then you go all the way towards the richest and the top 10%, what you find is that the Ginis will be very flat in the middle, essentially for 60, 70 percentile. And where income inequality shoots up is at the very low end among the poor and among the rich. And that, again, is something very useful to know, because what this means is that if you reach the poor, you can do a lot of good. So how do you reach the poor? We need to go to slide 5 if we can. We need a social protection system with minimum gaps, minimum inclusion and exclusion gaps. And that, can we go to slide 5? The next one. This is very hard to do. It requires a joint needs-based social protection system and a financially feasible insurance part, social insurance part against life risks. And for countries to be able to do that, there is a need for an effective system of personal identification so that double dipping can be avoided, and a workable and up-to-date social registry of people or households in need. Let me just conclude with the last slide. I was asked to give best practice examples in poverty reduction. And one example is very obviously China. 750 million people lifted out of absolute poverty. That's 3/4 of the global total over the past 4 decades. This was very effective, but it relied entirely on a fixed definition of absolute rural poverty, which was the big issue in China. But there are now issues coming up around urban poverty and so on. Mongolia, you have seen the decomposition. Mongolia is a country where the redistributive policies have been very, very strong. there was a robust set of social protection programs that reached a lot of people. And as you have seen, that has contributed twice the impact compared with rising income. And let me give the third example. It is the countries which are embracing the multidimensional poverty index. This is a great complement to a purely income-based absolute and relative poverty indicators. Relative poverty, of course, brings in distributional aspects, but MPI data can actually also be used to quantify dimensions of inequality. And Sabina Alkir, who is participating in this conference, can say more about that. And in Botswana, we are now discussing using this approach. Let me stop here. Thank you very much. Matilda, back to you.
Thank you, Balázs, and really important to give this perspective and the cases of China, Mongolia, but also you pointed to the MPI, importance of the MPI data that we were very interested, all of us, I think, during this morning, and we will hear more about that later. Many thanks, Balázs. Now I turn to hear in Bukhara the panelists. We have with us Mr. Obid Hakimov, the director of the Center for Economic Reform and Research, which has been conducting a significant body of work and inputs to the poverty reduction measures in general, and particularly the inputs to the poverty drafting of the poverty reduction strategy. So, Mr. Hakimov, it will be good to hear from you. What do you think are the, how do you see the effort in the going further? What are the highlights on the poverty reduction strategy that is in draft and it's in finalization stage at the moment from your perspective? Over to you.
Thank you, Matilda. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants of this event. And our Center for Economic Research and Reform was coordinating office when we developed our new strategy 22-26. Additionally, we also, together with Minister of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction, together with all international institutions such as UNDP, UNICEF, the World Bank, and other international organizations, we also developed a poverty reduction strategy for 22-26. So if we talk about a little bit about the highlights of about this strategy, so we would like to, as already in the in the first session, everybody heard that we would like to decrease our poverty rate by twice. So how are we going to do this? So that we have different directions. So the first direction of the work, so Mr. Puchkarov said that already, that the macroeconomic stability will be one of the the key bases for the developing any other economic policies. So basically, for example, you can see that in most of the countries that when you have a high inflation rate and the large budget deficits, it will be really difficult to talk about poverty reduction. So that's why one of the main highlights of our macroeconomic policy will be that the stable budget deficit and the stable inflation rate. So second most important direction of our poverty reduction strategy will be improving the system of the social assistance and the social services. So in this case, we would like to make in next 5 years the separate public the administration body, and the more advanced social protection system with the barrier-free environment for people with disabilities, and the integrated of the social assistance and all other employment programs. And we would like to see the changes in also our pension programs, because according to the study that the UNICEF, that only implementation of our public pension plan reduces the poverty rate in Uzbekistan about 39%. So that's why this is a really significant program, and we would like to further enhance our pension program and the other the social safety net programs. So if you look at the social safety net programs, if in 2000, I think in 19 about the 500,000 people were covered with our social protection system. So now almost 1.9 million, the households are taking social, the social benefits. So the next direction of our poverty reduction strategy is the social assistance and the services in need. And another one is like efficiency of the education system. So what we will see in next 5 years in the education system. So the Mr. Gulam already mentioned that, the preschool attendance rate will be increased up to the 80%. So right now it's about the 62%. So the high school, the higher education, the attendance will be increased from 28%, which is right now, to the 50%. And we also started new programs in, the middle schools. For example, let's say first two regions in RLC area, which is, the Karakalpakstan and the Khwarezm area. We introduced, the food at the school programs. And our center is planning to assess the efficiency of this, the food for school programs. And if we find that, that these programs are really efficient, and if we need to do some adjustments, we would like to, expand these programs all around the country and all other, the 12 regions of the Uzbekistan also. And another direction, which I have to say that, without improving the healthcare system, it will be really difficult to fight against poverty, because our center has 5 regional branches, and these 5 regional branches, they did the household surveys, and we found that the people who are in the poverty, they have lots of serious healthcare problems. Without solving these problems, we can give them the employment, we can give them the income. But, without solving these healthcare problems, which is, they're really expensive in these days, so it will be really difficult. So that's why we will have further, intensify our healthcare system. So what will be in the healthcare system, I would like to mention that, there will be special healthcare coverage for the poor people. On top of that, we are started already pilot program of the healthcare insurance programs, the public insurance. So the pilot program is going on in one region, which is the Sirdarya region. Soon it will be, expanded or, the scale all around the country. And another, the big changes in the healthcare system, we would like to further, develop the private healthcare system. And 80% in the pharmaceutical markets, we would like to further intensify the production of the pharmaceuticals and, the accessibility of the poor households to these, the expensive, the pharmaceutical products. Another direction, it will be direction number 6. So it's been already, intensively elaborated in the previous sections. This is the entrepreneurship. So what will be the entrepreneurship? So in the next 5 years, the poor households will be, getting this asset allocation program. So in this asset allocation program, until 2026, we would like to give away to the households for their, the agricultural production, 200,000 hectares. So this is about the 20% land which we are growing cotton right now. So we are giving away to these lands to the people who are in the poverty, so they can grow agriculture products, so they can increase their income. And so increasing the construction of the compact, the greenhouses, it will be about 300,000 hectare lands, and increasing the number of mahalas on the principle of the one district, one product, it will be about 4,250 mahalas. So they will be specialized on these products. And as you know that, on the entrepreneurship, so every year, Uzbekistan, just for family entrepreneurship program, we are spending about $1 billion for the small family entrepreneurship programs. And this programs also will be expanded. So if you look to the past 3 years, so more than 1 million households, they used these programs. And if you see that, the analysis, so you can see the significant change in most of these households in by using these programs. So employment already, that we explained, the Gulamov elaborated extensively. So right now, if you have the unemployment rate about 9%, so in the next 5 years, we are planning to reduce this unemployment rate up to the 6%. So another direction of the poverty reduction program will be that, the regional development programs. So in Uzbekistan, that we have 14 regions and we have regional disparities, so that these programs will be directed in order to not to increase the regional disparities. So the regions with disadvantages will get more investments compared to the other regions. So the last, the direction, I have to say that about our poverty reduction strategy, that, that we can develop the regions, but we also together done, the big study with the UNDP. So we have huge under investment in our infrastructure. So according to some estimates, it will be, in order to achieve the, the Millennium Development Goals, 4 to 6% of the GDP should be invested on infrastructure programs. So infrastructure programs also will be intensified. Just if you look to the drinking water, which is one of the essential, the part of our life being, and we want to increase accessibility to the, the clean water about to the 87% until 2026. I'm sorry. So these are the main directions of our poverty reduction strategies, and I think that in the close days, this poverty reduction strategy will be put on, the public discussions, and we will further, wait for more comments and your proposals further improve our poverty reduction strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hakimov. I think the way how you explained the highlights of the coming strategy very much resonates with one of the key points of the previous session about the multidimensional of the side of the poverty. It's not only about the monetary, but it's access to health, to education, and the basis for reducing it. So that's my first point. But then the second, I think that the measures that you already mentioned are in making. It's good that we have this panel that may reflect. I mean, I will be asking them to reflect on what they think about the hints that you've made and how that resonates with the previous developments in the country. And now, of course, it comes perfect to Will to take the floor, the senior economist in poverty and equality in Central Asia. And we always love to hear your presentation, Will, and to learn from you about different aspects of the social developments, poverty developments in Uzbekistan. You were very much into determining of the poverty line. In fact, you helped contributed a lot of the monetary poverty profile of Uzbekistan. So the question is, you have seen it all evolving over time. What do you get out of it? How it was moving over time and how you see it in the future, and of course, reflection of what has been suggested. Over to you in 5 or 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try to be fast, but thank you for the question so much. Yes, and the work on the poverty line, was the work of very many people in the room here. So it's been quite a journey with all of you, and it's an honor to be able to work together with you on it. So maybe three themes that I think are important to think about over the last few years in Uzbekistan with respect to poverty reduction. So the first maybe is labor income. And in particular, we know that in many countries that have been very successful in reducing poverty and keeping poverty low, labor income has been really the decisive factor for that. And this is a challenge in the case of Uzbekistan, because over the last few years, we've seen that actually it hasn't been driving poverty reduction as quickly as we would hope. And so there's a few, it bears some thinking about why that is. So one sort of big picture thing to maybe consider is that the share of all the income in the economy in Uzbekistan that goes to workers in the form of labor income is about 41%. So it's substantially lower, or it was in 2017 when this was last measured. So it's substantially lower than most countries in Europe and Central Asia. So the average is about 55%. And what this means is that when growth is happening in Uzbekistan, and we've seen some substantial growth over the last few years, the transmission mechanism, or the way that that growth passes through to workers and to families, is through this labor income. And because it's a smaller share of the economy, or of all of the income in the economy, this is sort of lagged as a driver of poverty reduction. And so thinking about sort of in the future how to strengthen that and how to make that transmission mechanism stronger to sort of perform as a poverty reducing factor is, I think, one of the key questions for the coming poverty reduction strategy. So the second important aspect I wanted to raise is the role of remittances in Uzbekistan. So, over the past few years, I think it's only become more clear how decisive the role of remittances has been in poverty reduction. So, the poverty rate would be about 7 percentage points higher if it weren't for remittances. So, probably one of the largest determinants overall. Most of those remittances are coming from workers living in Russia. And so one of the key things I think we should all be thinking about is the risks of having such a large share of the poverty reduction performance on something that is relatively shaky, and how to diversify that so that the poverty reduction can withstand the shocks and changes that we're all seeing today. So another maybe important point about this to consider also for the poverty reduction strategy is why remittances have been so effective at reducing poverty. And that has a lot to do with the reason that people are moving abroad. So a lot of the times when people are moving abroad, it's because local labor markets are underperforming and they can't find work where they live. And so when people go abroad, it's particularly those people who were at high risk of unemployment and who therefore are sending money back to areas of the country that are particularly in need. So it's a very well-targeted and effective poverty reducing tool, these transfers that are coming from migrants abroad. And so thinking about sort of the targeting of programs in those places that are really struggling, both in the labor market and in sort of making ends meet for low-income people, I think is really crucial to consider as well. So finally, the last aspect that I wanted to raise is on social assistance. So those of you who live here or are working in Uzbekistan know that this has seen huge changes over the last few years. So Uzbekistan previously did not have a very large share of government programs oriented towards transfers to low-income people. But during COVID, the COVID pandemic, the government very rapidly expanded these programs, targeting the people who are most in need. And this was an extremely effective rollout of a program that really protected a lot of people from falling into poverty during the crisis. So it more than doubled over a very short period of time. And so this is, I think, a real signature success of the government over the last few years in trying to improve the resilience of the population to the crisis. So I think a couple of things or a couple of lessons maybe that we can take from these sort of going forward for the poverty strategy. So one is, that increasing the transmission of income through the labor market to the low income people is really crucial. That really needs to be strengthened if we're going to see, Uzbekistan successfully reach its target of cutting poverty in half by 2026. So the private sector needs to be the leader in that. And in particular, there are some subsectors which are particularly promising. So the services sector has been underperforming for quite some time, but it's been doing a lot of the poverty reduction that we have seen in the labor market. And so the services sector is another area that we may want to consider sort of really focusing on making sure it's really doing its job in this respect. Another thing to consider, I think, is that historically Uzbekistan has had very little mobility, both spatially and between sectors. And so with greater flexibility, the labor market can adjust to changing circumstances more easily and adapt to the situation as it arises. So in particular, as Uzbekistan's economy is growing, the places that are going to grow are not going to be evenly spread out across the country. There are going to be some places that grow very quickly and others that grow less quickly. And it's very important that workers are able to move to those places that are most in demand of their skills. So this sort of flexibility, but also flexibility between the sort of jobs that they're doing now and the sort of jobs that are being created in the future. So these forms of flexibility are going to be very important for Uzbekistan to really take advantage of the transformation that's happening. Another maybe final point on the labor market is the opportunity that activating activating more female labor force participation would bring to Uzbekistan. There's quite a large role of discrimination in the labor market that reduces female labor force participation. We have a lot of evidence that this is the case, and really focusing on this, with a lot of determination, could very quickly improve the poverty reduction that the country is achieving. So I think a real focus on activating, and making it easier for women who right now are discouraged from participating in the labor market to be able to participate more fully. So the last point I wanted to make about social assistance is that this program, as I said before, has been extremely successful at increasing resilience. But there's also a lot of evidence that it can be improved, substantially improved. And the next phase, especially now that with the government's successful rollout of the social registry, the next phase is really making sure that those benefits are very well targeted to the people who need them most. Trying to identify people who currently are not benefiting from the program, even though they need it, and making sure that the benefits aren't going to people who may not need the support. In a context of limited resources, we really want to make sure that those are well targeted to the people who need it most during this time. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. So many points important. Thank you for coming with the lessons learned as well. And from the broader perspective, it's so obvious that they have to be very well synchronized, etc. And particularly grateful for the point on the gender, opportunity for more activating more of the female labor force. I would love that we come back to that question, I hope. But let me now invite, for the time being, Mr. Ricardo Pinto, who has been consulting UNDP on a number of fronts, including he was supporting the drafting of the poverty reduction strategy from our perspective, but also on the so-called future of work approach in Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan is not new for you, Ricardo. How would you assess the context, poverty reduction context at this moment in Uzbekistan, and particularly from the job creation perspective? We hear throughout the criticality of the creation of more jobs for poverty reduction. Over to you in 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matilda. Good afternoon to everybody. I feel extremely jealous that I wasn't able to go to Bukhara, but you have, so most of you. So congratulations to you for that. I hope next time I come to Uzbekistan, I'll have the pleasure of having seen Samarkand. It would be wonderful to also see beautiful Bukhara. So it's a pleasure to be with you and participate in this distinguished panel. Some of whom I know. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk for a few minutes. I've actually been working on two main themes in terms of Uzbekistan. One, as Matilda already says, I was lucky enough to coordinate some activities in relation to the work that actually led to the draft poverty reduction strategy. Of course, not just UNDP, but World Bank and many others, including people and then this audience. And of course, we produced detailed poverty analysis and a series of recommendations. From what I heard in terms of what Mr. Kakimov mentioned earlier, pretty much a substantive part of this earlier research has found its way into the draft poverty reduction strategy. And it's very nice to hear that certain key elements of that have been incorporated, including various themes such as the regional dimension and so on. So UNDP is currently now focusing a lot of its activities on the multi-dimensional poverty index, which will start this year. It already covers 100 countries. And I think in addition to this contribution to the poverty reduction strategy, there's going to be quite a lot more policy relevant analysis coming through. Matilda mentioned the freedom of work issue, future of work issue. This is something which is fundamental to UNDP. There's a process of reviewing the portfolio of its activities with a view to seeing things through the prism or the lens of future of work debate. And I think that many issues there arising that will connect with what Will and others have already been talking about. It's almost certain that green growth will be a particularly important theme, significant investment going in this area, the need for the labor force to be adjusted to the future needs of the labor market, of obviously certain aspects of social protection, which have already been highlighted. Labor migrants will stress the importance of remittances and maybe over-reliance on that. And that's one of the other themes that is going to be covered by UNDP going forward. The theme of this panel is pretty much about lessons learned and a focus on Uzbekistan. I would like to focus a little bit on a wider perspective, because I've been working in Ukraine for the last 7 years or so and continue to work there. And I think from what I heard from Matilda's earlier comments, there is an openness to look at the poverty reduction strategy and finding additional focuses and emphasis and so on. And I think there's a significant set of global trends that are rising that will affect poverty. And these need to be talked about, these need to be taken into consideration, and the ultimate poverty reduction activities need to be adjusted in the light of these. So that's what I'd like to talk about, because what is happening in that part of the world right now is having a significant effect on these emerging global trends. And we have people here from various international financial institutions in the panel as well. And I think some of these aspects also connect with their concerns going forward. The key one, of course, is ultimately about the amount of food that's produced in Ukraine and Russia. They produce alone 30% of global exported wheat, 70% sunflower, and of course, a significant amount of fertilizers. That also is the case in relation to Belarus. War means that 90% of grain export or grain that would have been exported is not flowing out. Only 60–70% of non-war affected land was cultivated this spring, and that means that problems are pre-programmed, which will also affect your country. It's clear that most emerging world, around 20 to 40% of income, household income, flows into food. But of course, grain prices have shot up by around 60% since January. And this has significant implications on people's ability to afford food. UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres recently said that war and blockade of the Azov and Black Sea will have a significant effect in the next few years, leading to malnutrition, mass hunger, and famine. There's already significant numbers of people facing emergency levels of hunger. And of course, it's not just about food in terms of what's happening right now. You add in the mixture of double-digit inflation, mostly connected with massive oil and gas price surges in the region of about 50% in 2022 alone. And what we have is a major cost of living crisis affecting all countries, including Uzbekistan. So the issue is this amounts to a major cost of living crisis, which is affecting pretty much all countries. We see in recent cases, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, what's been happening there, and the implications are clear for a few other countries. We have a representative from the WHO. We should not forget that COVID has been a massive accelerator of poverty, including in Uzbekistan. But the pandemic is far from over. As we can see in China, North Korea, and many other countries, COVID will continue to rumble in the background. Supply chain issues will continue for the foreseeable future. And then you add in the global warming picture, the increasing temperatures, which tend to reduce yields because crops then produce less grain. Extreme weather events destroy crops and livelihoods. We see unprecedentedly high temperatures in various countries. India and many other countries, 21 countries in all, have already stopped exporting food, which amounts to about 10% of all global trade. I'm coming to an end now, and I just want to mention that Achim Steiner, the administrator of UNDP, was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he said that there's developing nations, this one included, will face a triple threat. That triple threat is food crisis, fuel crisis, and financial crisis. He didn't mention COVID, didn't mention climate change, but effectively these are baked into these issues. We're talking about triple crisis, triple F crisis of fuel, food, and finance. But it's not going to be restricted to developing nations. Brits and Germans already having to make choices about whether to buy food, whether to pay their heating bills, whether to pay their rent. The cost of living crisis is going to push 1.3 million people into absolute poverty in the UK alone. So the implications for other countries are pretty clear. Of course, it's not all bad. The situation is expected to really greatly accelerate the green transition, which is essential as alternative energy sources are sought and significant additional investments will come on stream. Coming back to the theme of the panel, of course, there are plenty of success stories. Will has highlighted some of them and lessons learned. One of those lessons learned is that we need to recognize global trends early and respond to them well in advance. The government of Uzbekistan is clearly paying attention to the issue of poverty, as shown by this poverty reduction strategy. The early comments made it clear the government is open to further suggestions and changes. We have that opportunity now to engage with that before it's finalized and approved. So basically, to conclude, that poverty reduction strategy was basically drafted at a time when the COVID pandemic was the principal, let's say, concern driving many of the activities there. The point is that it wasn't geared so much to this broader set of issues that are now converging. And so if we have the opportunity to still adjust some of this strategy, then this is the time to use the experiences that are coming through from this panel and ensure these are incorporated and this poverty reduction strategy takes these issues into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. I realize now that probably you could have spoken the first and give us the global background in which we are accurately aware of, basically, and the government very much. But it's, yes, definitely, that is the context in which everyone is operating, and those are very well recognized. I think in the previous session that was very clearly coming, and the priority set around that. The point about, in fact, the key is about the learning and adjusting and building the resilience of the systems throughout. That is one of the key important points that are coming. Let us now go back to the specifics of the background, the environment in Uzbekistan. When Mr. Obid Hakimov was talking about and started with the highlights of the poverty reduction strategy in finalization, you started with the macroeconomic background and with the set. So that's the right question to ask to the IMF representative in Uzbekistan, Mr. Kevin Ross. How do you see the macroeconomic and stability as a conducive and impacting of the poverty reduction and the structural reforms in general? Over to you.
Thank you for the question. Basically, when I look at Uzbekistan and the performance of the macroeconomy and the reduction in poverty, what stands out to me is you've had a relatively large reduction in poverty in a country with not a large social spending program. That is more or less has come online recently, as William said, as COVID crisis took place. But basically, you see that the main reasons why poverty has been reduced is strong growth, macroeconomic stability by good policies that have been put in place by the Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, and the government of Uzbekistan. I think, as everybody knows, when you have instability, the poor are the most unlikely or unable to avoid the negative impacts of instability. The performance here in Uzbekistan is strong growth. Inflation is still, high, but it has been higher and it's coming down. So at the end of the day, the government has been able to keep that stability when there's been a lot of negative shocks in the region, from Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, COVID, and now the war in Ukraine. Another thing I think that should be highlighted about this is the structure of the Uzbek economy. As William mentioned, the remittances, but it also has gold production, which when things go bad in the global economy, gold prices rise. And that kind of acts as a natural hedge, natural stabilizer for the economy. Remittances, I think, has been probably the key driver of the reduction in poverty, again, with a relatively small social spending framework inside Uzbekistan. I think something like 9 out of the 14 regions get something like 18 to 27% of their income from remittances. Remittances tend to be countercyclical. For shocks that happen in the receiving country, migrants send more money back when that occurs. So far in this shock, after, in March, there was a decline in remittances, but that has come back up. There's a lot of kind of wait and see, is this going to continue? And I think there's a lot of things may still play out negatively. We'd have to see. So the structure, the remittances, the gold, but also again, back to the fact that the government, the authorities have understood how to do countercyclical policies, I think, maybe for the first time. There's a large literature about emerging market countries graduating to implementing countercyclical policies. Not too long ago, many emerging market countries had pro-cyclical policies. When there was a negative shock, they made it worse. But that's not been the case here. It has been recognized early that there was an issue. There was something like 5% of GDP stimulus that was implemented during 2020, 2021. Which offset the negative impact of COVID. This year, the government is already going to slow the pace of fiscal consolidation, allocating more resources for people that are being impacted by the current kind of negative outside scenario. I think one thing that you mentioned, distribution of income, and Balash also mentioned the distribution of income. If you can change that, the growth impact or the impact on poverty for any growth will be better when there's a shift in the distribution of income more toward the poor, obviously. And Balash mentioned that in his econometric results that he presented. That hasn't happened here too much, at least from the estimates of the Gini coefficient, the distribution of income. I think that has to be understood. I think before, the growth impact on poverty reduction was something like 1.5% reduction in poverty for every 1% of GDP per capita. That was in 2010 to 2015, and now more recently is around 1. So it's having a less effect, and I think that needs to be analyzed and studied and understood. I do believe one way is to put more emphasis on education and health, kind of like the pre-distribution, and then afterwards, the taxes, transfers, and other policies that the government is putting forth, currently. On the fiscal extra spending that's taking place, allocations that are taking place for vulnerable families and individuals that are being impacted by negative shocks. Uzbekistan basically has run structural surpluses until recently. So this extra spending for social spending is a structure, if it's permanent, is a structural increase in expenditures. You haven't seen the structural increase in revenue. So you're getting a structural deficit that's creeping into the macroeconomy, which at some point into the future, that needs to be looked into in terms of your fiscal strategy. I'll just point to one. I wanted to talk about one individual program, which was I think the importance of information and data and analyzing these programs. You had a larger decrease in poverty, but not too much in programs in terms of social spending. We're now implementing these programs. There's a poverty reduction strategy that's taking place. My office is at the central bank, so I look at tend to take a look more at the financial view of things. I look at this Every Family is an Entrepreneur, which is the main program that the government has for increasing economic inclusion in the country. As you mentioned, it's about $1 billion a year that they're placing. They've had success in placing it, but I have yet to see like an evaluation of what is that money being. It's a loan. Is that money coming back? Because it should be recycling, right? They make the loans, the money comes back, you do it again. There shouldn't be a $1 billion every budget and assume it's never coming back. So the point is, all of these programs need assessment. It needs data. And I think across the board in Uzbekistan, data, information for everybody to understand what is taking place and to evaluate any program. Obviously, I think any analyst will tell you that's the first thing that you need. I will say, in a positive note, the integration of I think the various iron books and more, I guess, openness about what's inside those books, it's been a positive development. Instead of having books here, books, youth, rural, you're integrated into one place. But again, transparency, information, let's evaluate, do what works, expand it. What doesn't work, get rid of it and turn around and do something different. I'll stop there.
So I think we all agree about the point on the data, which brings to the question of is the poverty reduction strategy incorporating monitoring and evaluation, we call it frameworks, and that is a question that we will park for the time being. But a good perspective on the macroeconomic stability, Kevin. That's the distribution of the impact that's of the income. That point particularly important, and it keeps coming. Thank you for that. But let's now turn to ADB. ADB is supporting the country in many fronts, and particularly in infrastructure development, but also on the social and socially owned, state-owned enterprises. I keep making that mistake, given my background. It's the privatization process as well, and the reforming. How that, and it was mentioned as one of the pillars of the poverty reduction strategy, the infrastructure investment. So how, and Enrico, if you can tell us how you see the linkages between that and your work as well, of course.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Matilde, for both the question and invitation to be on this panel, and for our hosts, of course, the ministry. It is the reform path is quite clear now. I think we all subscribe to that. We all subscribe to the fact that the presence of SOEs in this economy are still quite heavy. What is striking is, of course, often these SOEs are not just an enterprise; they're actually a sector. So they invest, they operate, they regulate. So it's really fascinating that we have to take even a bigger picture on not just the corporate itself. If you're talking about in the context of both green growth and poverty reduction, I think I like to maybe focus on the sector that I think, in terms of reforms and efficiency, has made quite a bit of progress, which is the energy sector. Now, ADB and the other development partners, we have supported the reforms. We have supported the first step, which has been the unbundling of the SOE, which has created different SOEs for generations, transmission, and distribution. And if we look at that reform, it really opens up to what we hope is going to be green jobs by fostering or eliminating barriers to participation of the private sector, in particular independent power producers. So this is in line with a very ambitious target, which is, I believe, by 2030, 7 gigawatt of solar and 5 gigawatt of wind. And we, as IFIs, we all taking a very active role. ADB, IFC, we have mandated for advising up to 1 gigawatt at the beginning, and now we're going to 2 gigawatts. So this is the part of the reforms that I think is very conducive to creating green jobs and helping, of course, in the poverty reduction. However, I think there's a big elephant in the room, and it was mentioned this morning, which is the tariff reform. This is more challenging. This is what's coming up. Find a way to liberalize the tariffs and create a differentiated tariff structure. It's really the next step. And while market liberalization is needed, it really needs to be managed carefully to protect the lower income population. I think I don't want to quote the Deputy Prime Minister Kushkarov, but yes, there is a need to neutralize the costs of these reforms. So I would like to maybe leave, I'm conscious of time, so raise a couple of points or food for thought or even lessons to some extent. So I think it's important that we come to an understanding that in terms of job creation, this green transition has to be managed. We all support renewables. We're all in favor of diversifying the matrix. However, renewables have limitation. Technology is catching up to be able to provide stability and eventually some sort of base load. But the country is still heavily reliant on fossil fuel and gas. So I think for both for in a bigger picture, we need to assure that stability of the provision of energy keeps going both for the households and also for the enterprises which generate employment. The second point I'd like to make is, as I mentioned, we all strive for tariff reforms towards cost recovery, especially if we want to try to stimulate more private sector participation. Now, again, this is the hardest part of the reform, and this is also the reform that will impact whether we want to have some more private sector participation in the other two streams, the transmission and the distribution. So in the bigger scheme of things, this has to be thought through because it will impact eventually the affordability both for enterprises and individuals, especially low incomes. The last point I would like to make, and I also want to refer back to what Sabina said in an opening panel today. It's, yes, we need to involve the private sector. Yes, we need to involve possibly the capital markets, and to be able to green even more both the enterprises, the jobs, and overall economy. Now, there are key items though to make it happen, and I think we're all working on that direction. Is for enterprises to be able to become greener, to be able to issue green bonds, to be able to do to be a recipient of green credit lines, to be able to assist SMEs in their greening. They have to adhere to a certain level of corporate standards, corporate governance standards, and a certain level of financial reporting, IFRS. These are the requirements that these enterprises will need to comply with, especially the SOEs, to be able to then foster the virtuous cycle of green bonds and green jobs and overall, ideally improve the disposable income of the low-income population. So I'll leave you with this food for thought. I tried to make it in 5 minutes. I hope it was enough, but I hope it was provocative enough.
Yes, definitely it was, and also you pointed to the fine line to make sure that the impact is positive, both for the environment is positive, both for the households and for the enterprises, because they depend on each other, and pointing to the green jobs indeed, and many other. Thank you for that. I hope we have a time to come back to some of the points. But then we left the last panelist will be our colleague Christopher Fitzpatrick from the Senior Health Policy Advisor of WHO. Not because of the health is not so important, but I think just to hear, you see it was coming throughout the health and the criticality of having access to health, and the quality of the health services was very much clear. The intention to improve, the strategies in the sector. So, Chris, the question to you would be how you see this line of reforms in the health sector that are being planned, how to link them to the poverty reduction from your perspective. Over.
Yeah. Thank you, Matilda, and thank you very much to the panelists that also invoked the health sector and its role in poverty reduction. I'm honored to be here to share some of WHO's reflections, indeed, on progress and lessons learned in poverty reduction in connection with health sector reform. Health sector reform has, of course, been one of the pillars of the government of Uzbekistan's social policy since at least 1991. And the process of health sector reform as an instrument of social policy has gone through many phases. I think we in the health sector have to admit that some of these phases had a mixed impact on the poorest and most vulnerable. Coverage with primary care facilities increased over this period of reform, particularly in the rural areas. However, this coverage with infrastructure, with health infrastructure, wasn't always accompanied with coverage in quality services or perceptions of the population of quality in services. Low trust, particularly at the primary care level, has persisted in the communities, within the communities that most need those services. Financial resources, increasingly private, actually flowed more to the specialized tertiary centers. And we know that out-of-pocket spending at newly privatized pharmacies increased steadily over time, such that by 2019, out-of-pocket spending by households accounted for almost 60% of total health spending. This was, about the average, slightly higher than the average for Central Asia, but more than double the average for the WHO region of Europe. Very worryingly, nearly a fifth of households experienced catastrophic health spending. This is a level of spending relative to income that WHO and the World Bank have deemed catastrophic for households, with really creating real financial hardship. And so beginning in 2019, the country embarked on a really comprehensive, far-reaching reform of the health sector, known as the Concept on Health Sector Development, to the year 2025. The overall objective to improve the health status of the population through the means of universal health coverage. So that is ensuring access to an essential package of health services to all, for all, without financial hardship. The strategy to get there really focused on the unfinished work of strengthening primary healthcare. It highlighted the need for equitable distribution of resources, protection of the population from these catastrophic health expenditures, and interestingly, a shift from passive or input-based allocation of resources towards more active strategic purchasing of outputs and services that it really that would contribute to improved efficiency, but also equity and quality, of course. And then in 2020, as we know, COVID-19 pandemic struck around the world, not just in Uzbekistan. It hit the most vulnerable groups the hardest, directly and indirectly. So directly through higher infection rates, worse treatment outcomes. Severity and fatality of the disease was very closely linked to comorbidities with risk factors that fall very heavily on the poorest members of society. Indirectly, through decreased access to health services, which were disrupted both on the supply as well as on the demand side. In Uzbekistan, in 2020, 18% of households surveyed by the World Bank, in fact, reported that at least one household member had not sought medical treatment due to the cost, due to the out-of-pocket expenditure that they would have to incur for that. So the pandemic highlighted the need for improved resilience, again, primarily on the front lines, at the first point of contact with communities. It emphasized the role of primary healthcare in prevention, detection, diagnosis, and treatment of infectious diseases, but also maintaining continuity in essential health services during these outbreaks. It gave urgency to innovations in primary care, including mobile health and telemedicine, which we see now everyone sees as very promising. But of course, there is always a risk that some populations will be left behind as we move forward with some of these new technologies in the health sector. The pandemic was also, by the way, a warning about what happens when you tie health benefits to employment. We can talk about that more later. Anyway, in the midst of the pandemic, in spite of the tremendous response, mobilization of the whole of government to the pandemic, Presidential Resolution 4890 was passed, introducing measures of implementation of a new model of healthcare and mechanisms of state health insurance in the Sudaria region, as Mr. Hakimov has already told us about. Again, with a focus on strengthening primary healthcare. WHO has been really enthusiastic in its support for this particular resolution, not just as an instrument of achieving universal health coverage, but indeed we feel very strongly as an instrument of reducing poverty in Uzbekistan. Indeed, international evidence confirms that the establishment of this strategic purchasing agency, in the case of Uzbekistan, it's called the State Health Insurance Fund, that guarantees an essential package of health services and medicines funded by general taxes, at this stage not by payroll taxes. And again, in the Uzbek context, we can get into the reasons for that, related to formalization or lack of formalization of the labor market and a desire not to create disincentives for formalization. But that this international evidence really supports that this is the best way forward to achieve equitable coverage of quality services to the whole population, regardless of income or employment status. Also, by the way, we think the right mechanism to engage the private sector in a really structured way and create a stable, interesting market for pharmaceuticals that local manufacturers could then also step up to meet. Anyway, I will conclude just saying that we really believe that this process of reform of the health sector in Uzbekistan, it's an ongoing process with pilot and plans for rapid scale up. It holds real promise for poverty reduction in the country. But primary healthcare, by its very definition, requires cross-community engagement and cross-sectoral engagement. So while we appreciate already the great collaboration that has been going on between Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, we see participation here of dear colleagues, we need to recommit to this cross-sectoral approach to health sector reform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. You clearly pointed to the criticality of the cross-sectoral approach if it is to work for the benefit of for having an equitable, as you said, equitable quality services reaching everyone. And then the importance of community participation, you have engagement, you have stressed. Thank you for doing that. Now, colleagues, I think we have 3 minutes left, and after we will be at the risk of being kicked off from the conference, from the room. But let me ask if there are any questions from the audience. No? Yes, over to you, Madam Ambassador.
So this is a very short question because there is very little time, but in fact it's to Mr. Obid Hakimov. We've heard about the lessons learned, and in particular I would say the good lessons. I mean the good idea or the best cases. And in fact, I was wondering, is there anything that you have seen over the years? I mean, some of the, let's say, bad examples or bad lessons that we can learn from as well. Because my feeling is that we're always talking about the good cases and the good examples, but sometimes we're forgetting that in fact some of the failures, and sometimes we do have failures, and we have, I mean, and we invest in failures, but these can also have very, in fact, are very good examples also for the future, so that we avoid them, but we learn from them, and we can sort of move on.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, you're right that there will be always good lessons and the bad lessons. You know, as we discussed right now in the beginning. So right just now came to my mind that when we start this family entrepreneurship program, at the beginning, for example, let's say when we started giving people like chicken or something else, you know, go. We didn't think about it, you know, if they know to grow these things, you know, if they have the skills. So, you know, that this was kind of, you know, one of the not good lessons for us. And, you know, immediately from the next year, all programs were adjusted. So now people who are kind of, you know, participating, you know, in these kind of programs, they have this new whole big program of, you know, the skill education programs. So these people are educated first, you know, how to, you know, do these kind of small entrepreneurship or small family businesses. So as you can see that these education and the skill programs significantly improve the, you know, the performance of these programs. Yes, thank you.
Which speaks about the importance of reflecting and learning from what one is doing. Now, if the ministry is allowing me, I will ask one question to the panelists for one sentence response. It was interesting what Mr. Kuchkarov was saying in the morning, many things, but he was saying he was asking his deputies, tell me what to do. So what would you advise in one sentence, Mr. Kuchkarov, what to focus on in terms of poverty reduction, having said all of this? You.
Well, I think the response that there's no silver bullet was the right one. It's a very difficult challenge, but I think there are some things that are that lend themselves to quick progress. And one thing I would really focus a lot on is making it as easy as possible to employ people. So making it as simple and straightforward as possible to hire new people and making sure that that's as free of discrimination as possible is one way that Uzbekistan could both make some progress on the informality issue, but also try to activate more of the population in employment.
Thank you, Will. It was 2 sentences or 3, but anyway, it works.
I think I can be brief. Keep macro stability while you do the second round more complex structural reforms. That will create a private sector that will create employment and jobs. And I think we'll solve a lot of the problems.
Very clear. Enrico, I think I know, but it's good to hear.
No, it's fine. I think I subscribe to continue the reform path, but one thing I would recommend to take advantage of the opportunity that derives from digitalization. I think there is a way to actually maybe even improving the reporting of the data on these programs. I think the opportunity that digitalization.
Yes, we did not mention it specifically, but a very important point. Chris.
So in health, we said that universal health coverage is a journey, not a destination. And with that in mind, I would focus really on creating the right mechanisms for continuous improvement, both in health sector reform and its connection to poverty reduction. So in that respect, I really welcome. I think we have established with the State Health Insurance Fund a supervisory board that is cross-sectoral, involving Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy and Poverty Reduction, Ministry of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, Mahalas, or the regional governance structures, NGOs. And so my request would be to really engage actively in that cross-sectoral collaboration to find those opportunities where health sector reform and poverty reduction can really complement each other. Thank you.
Yes, we cannot agree more. Mr. Robert Hakimov.
So my own suggestion would be productivity, because at the end of the day, the value added is created only because of the productivity. So we have to admit that our economy is one of the shortcomings is we have the lower productivity. We have to concentrate on more productivity. Thank you.
Thank you. And the online speaker panelists, do we have anyone? A sentence, one short advice?
Yes, if I may. In the context of a lot of the discussions, the expressions green growth, green transition, green jobs have been mentioned. It is pretty clear there's a significant level of investment. We talked about infrastructure coming through. The concern, however, is that once this investment is there, the skill sets are not going to be. So if there is one message, it is about the education system, it's about the TVET system, and ensuring that the skill sets are there to then be able to actually go into the employment opportunities that will soon be coming.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think with that, we are closing the session. There were many excellent inputs and points, and I hope that we have also a clarity of the key messages that are coming. Many thanks to the panelists. It has been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. It's okay.
Ana xushtaki. Hozir bir-ikki deb e'lon qildi. Keyingi forum boshlanganda emasmi? Sho's boshlanganda aytmayapmi? Yo'q, hozir o'sha forum.
Davr. Nima deysiz?
Biriktaga boshlandi. Nimani boshlaydi, okey? Hozir siz ham boshlayapsiz. Nimaga? Mana buni aytmayapmi hozir? Oshga taklif qilganmi? Nodir Devonbegimga taklif qilganmi?
Yo'q, hali yana bor unaki sessiya. Mana,
Yomon qildinglar-ku.
break.
Hop.
Keyin undan keyin mana bu panel 5 bor, sessiya 5 bor.
Yomon qildinglar.
Dear ladies and gentlemen,
Hop.
now we are inviting you to the
To'rda boshlanish kerak edi. To'rda boshlanish kerak edi. Keyin panel sessiya. Shu cho'zilib ketdi. Shuning uchun breakdan keyin boshlanadi. Yo'q, bu breakdan keyin bo'ladi. Yana sessiya borib ketdi.
Hurmatli forum ishtirokchilari, 10 daqiqadan so'ng keyingi sessiyamizga start beramiz. Dear guests, the second session will start after 10 minutes. 10 minut delay, okay?